Welcome back. In this last video, in the three video series, we're going to talk about attention to or the conscious or controlled attention system. If you remember from the previous videos so far, we've discussed attention system 1. Now we're moving on to attention system 2. Now, when we say attention system 2, we are referring to the selective attention, then attention as a resource, and supervisory attentional system. But we'll not talk about SAS or supervisory attentional system in this unit. We'll talk about it in the next unit. Another name for supervisory attentional system is short-term memory or working memory. The outcomes for this unit include the general level, kind of reviewing though, to talk about control and input attentional differences, attention 1 and attention 2, the system 1 and system 2. System 1 and system 2. Then talk about two aspects of controlled attention, which is selective attention and divided attention. And we'll talk about theory specific to selective attention. Then we'll talk about the inhibition versus filtering process of deselection, and end it by talking about attention as a resource. So let's get started with control versus input attention at a general level, which we have done previously, but just to kind of give you a sense, if you remember the Friesman's experiments on visual search, we said that it's easier to search information on in the disjunctional condition than the conjunctional condition. In other words, if information pops out, right, we're probably using the attention system 1. In other words, it's fast, automatic, and it's not intentional. Whereas when you're looking for information, a red dot here, it's not automatic, it's not popping up. It's actually taking attentional system 2 into account. It's slow, it's controlled, and it is intentional. Now, two aspects of control attention. When there is controlled attention, you are consciously involved in that. In other words, you're making the selection or deselection. Now, there is another possibility, which is called divided attention. So, selective attention and divided attention are related to the controlled aspect of attentional process. And that's what we'll talk about now. So, first we'll talk about divided attention, then we'll talk about
Selective
selective.
attention. When you say divided attention, you basically dividing your attention resources between two
Tasks. In other words, you're dividing your attention. You're trying to be aware of more than one thing. Let's say you're driving and texting, and driving and eating, or things like those, multitasking. Keep in mind that multitasking is myth in the sense that it feels like you can do multiple things, but what you're basically doing is you are switching between tasks. I know one task seems very easier than the other one, doesn't mean that you're doing both at the same time. For instance, if you can listen to music and study, well, you're not listening to music when at any given point of time when you are studying. You're either in music, listening to music, or reading. So most of the times you're switching between tasks. So also when you drive and text, you think that you can text well or you can drive well. Well, keep in mind if you're driving in on a new road and you don't know the route as well, then it requires higher, more conscious resources, right? So the point here is that multitasking, the idea that they can do multiple things is because you've done something so much so that it end up requiring fewer attentional resources. Driving can never be one such thing, although it feels like it, because when you're driving, you need to be alert. Okay. So if divided attention is dividing your resources or trying to be aware of more than one thing at a time, selective attention is opposite in the sense that you're selectively attending to one and ignoring the rest of the information. Now you're listening to me, right? But if you pay attention, you'll also hear other sounds in this particular environment. Can you hear that? I don't know if you hear it. That's my niece and my daughter. They're playing outside. If you heard that, you are trying to selectively attend to part of the information by deselecting the other. No, another example would be if you have a loud sounding fan or something and still listening to me, you're probably ignoring that background noise and trying to pay attention to my voice. That is selective attention too. Selective attention is basically narrowing down on a part of the stimulus and deselecting the other. So you can see the difference between selective and divided attention here. Divided attention is trying to be aware of two things. Selective attention is trying to just be aware of one thing by deselecting the other. Now let's try and see how good you are in selective attention. So you'll be presented with the video. Your task is to count the number of passes. So in the next slide, I want you to watch the video and do as it is described in the video. I'll see you on the slide after the video. Please make sure you watch the video before you move on to hear me in the next slide.
This is a test of selective attention. Count how many times the players wearing white passed the basketball. How many passes did you count? The correct answer is 15 passes. But did you see the gorilla? This video is from research by Daniel Simons and Christopher Chabris and is copyrighted. It is available for use in talks, training, and teaching on DVDs from VisCog Productions. Learn more at theinvisiblegorilla.com.
Well, did you notice the gorilla? My goodness. Well, usually you're not supposed to, but these days, not just cognitive, other classes are also showing this video. So if you're not one of them who watched this video, then you have noticed gorilla, right? Well, let's try another video. Let's see if I can trick you there. Okay, so go to the next slide and watch the video, and I'll see you after the video on the next slide.
The monkey business illusion. Count how many times the players wearing white passed the ball. The correct answer is 16 passes. Did you spot the gorilla? For people who haven't seen or heard about a video like this before, about half missed the gorilla. If you knew about the gorilla, you probably saw it. But did you notice the curtain changing color or the player on the black team leaving the game? Let's rewind and watch it again. Here comes the gorilla, and there goes a player, and the curtain is changing from red to gold. When you're looking for a gorilla, you often miss other unexpected events. And that's the monkey business illusion. Learn more about this illusion and the original gorilla experiment at theinvisiblegorilla.com.
Well, you noticed the gorilla? Definitely. But if you haven't watched this video, I'm pretty sure you definitely not noticed the curtain color changing. The point here is that your senses capture more information than you can attend to at any given point of time because your attention resources are limited. Then when you are selecting a part of the sense information, then you are deselecting the rest, correct? So when you know that there will be gorilla, you'll be concentrating on gorilla. In doing so, you'll be ignoring the curtain changing color aspect of it. So there's always a way to selectively attend to a part of the information. In doing so, you're also deselecting the other. So as you can see, the how selective attention or divided attention for that matter involves controlled attentional processes because you're consciously choosing to and deciding and actually making selections and deselections. So, um, so that is about selective attention. Okay, so now that we know what selective attention is, which is basically selectively focusing on a part of the stimulus and then filtering out or ignoring the rest. It's basically selecting and deselecting, selecting what you want to and deselecting what you don't want to. Now here's the question: what happens to the unattended information? The information that you're deselecting, is it processed at all? Think about it. Now, just imagine if I ask you to find a nickel from this particular bunch of coins. Now, do you directly go to nickel and pick it? Or do you also process other coins, then choose the nickel? Think about it. I'll talk more about it in the next slide. So the question we were asking was, do you even process the deselected information? Well, think about it. When you're asked to find a nickel, you don't just go to the nickel, right? For you to know if this is a nickel, you need to process everything first. Because if you know it is already here, then you're not even sensing information, right? In other words, how do you know what to select before you actually scan through all the possible coins here? So it is logical to assume then that we process both the information that you're selecting and the information that you're not selecting, because doing so alone will let you decide. In other words, will let you select what you want. So the idea is that we do process unattended information to some extent. The question is, to what extent? So this brings us to the third outcome, which is about the theories of selective attention. And there are several theories, right? But this theories can be are of two basic types. One is the early selection theories. The other one is the late selection theories. So you can divide theories into two categories, early and late. Now, they both answer the same question. To what extent is unattended information processed? According to early selection theory, we only process the physical features, both attended and to be attended and unattended information. In other words, you process only the color or the shape or the size of all the coins here before you select what you want. Okay, so the selection is early because physical features are the first thing that you process, and later on you'll process the meaning, like knowing a dime or a nickel is 10 cents and a quarter is 25 cents. That comes later. Whereas late selection theories, on the other hand, assume that it's not only the physical features that you process, but you also process the meaning related to these features. So you not only process the shape or color, but you also process the worth of these coins. So the selection is later, not immediate. Now, these experiments often use Cherry, Cherry, Cherry's dichotic listening task. So it's important we understand what this task is. In a dichotic listening task, it's a dichotic listening. Dichotic referring to two, listening. It's a task involving listening to two different audio sounds. The primary task, so you can see different information is sent to the two ears. The primary task of the participant would be to shadow information sent to one ear. In other words, to repeat, shadow is to repeat the sound heard in to be attended ear or the shadow ear. In this case, the left ear of the participant is the shadowed ear, and the participant has to repeat the information presented in the left ear. The information that presented in the left ear says President Lincoln often read by the light of the fire. And the participant repeats that, right? That's the primary task. The secondary task that the participant would be unaware of is to ignore the information that is presented to the unattended ear. The horses galloped across the field. So in these tasks, the logic is that participant would be asked information specific to or related to information presented to the unattended or ignored ear. Because the participant was asked to attend to only this information and not the other information, whatever the participant remembers about the information sent to the unattended ear would give us answers to the question about how much do we process unattended information, or to what extent do we process unattended information. In the earlier experiments by Cherry, it was pretty clear that participants would actually report about some aspect of the unattended ear, but not all. For instance, they can actually point out that it was a male voice or a female voice, or whether it's English or other language, but they were unable to actually pinpoint the meaning conveyed in that sentence. So that led to these early selection theories. The idea was that you only process the physical features, like, okay, the amplitude, the sound, the pitch, whether it's a male or female, whether it's English, things like those were identified, which are related to the physical features. So the Cherry's experiment led to the idea that we make the selection early on by superficially processing information. So one of the classic theories, the very first theory you can see on attention select theories of attention was Broadbent's theory of attention. His idea was that information kind of goes through a filter, right? Information goes through a filter, and anything that passes through the filter is what is attended to, and everything that's left on the other side of the filter is unattended to. And this physical filter features or filters the physical features of it. Just imagine filter, a coffee filter or a tea filter, and you're pouring water on the filter with the tea leaves in it, right? What comes out of the filter is this liquid that is colored. But what passed through the filter is the color and the fragrance and things like those, things that are smaller inside. But the actual leaves that are bigger, they didn't go through because the filter is filtering based on the size. So according to Broadbent's theory, only physical features of unattended information, right, they can pass through the filter. Only physical features information. In other words, the selection is made too early. If it passes through the filter, and again, this is an analogy, if the features are similar, smaller, or larger, you make a decision. Well, when do we make the selection then? Is it too early, as the early selection theory suggests, or is it too late, as the late selection theory suggests? Well, now we know that it depends. If there's less noise, in other words, if the information pops out, we probably make a decision early on, only by processing the physical features. But if there's a lot of noise, then we'll probably use the late selection process by processing at least definitely the physical features, but more than physical features, features that would help you make a decision. Now, how is this deselection made? Now, we know how we make the selection, all right? Now, what about the deselection? You're selecting what you want to pay attention to. But what happens to the unselected? Is deselection an active process or a passive process? Now, that's what we'll talk about. The next outcome is to talk about inhibition and filtering. Inhibition is a passive process
of deselection. Sorry, filtering is a passive process of deselection. I'm sorry about this. Stay the person in the middle and ignore the rest.
Usually it is because the center person is salient here, and the other individuals are not so salient. So it's easy for you to pay attention to this and ignore the rest. So this is a filtering out process. Let's look at the next slide and see if it would be easier for you or difficult to ignore the surroundings and pay attention to person in the middle. What do you say? Well, it's difficult because the unimportant is salient. So it's not an active process. It's not a passive process, an active process of inhibition. So the deselection you make can be passive, active. If it's passive, it's called filtering. When the unattended information is not salient, but when it is salient, it is active when it's called inhibition. Okay, remember what we're doing now. We talked about attention system 2, and we looked at selective attention, and now the last thing we need to talk about is the attention as a resource, and the SAS we'll talk about in the next unit. So the next outcome is to talk about what is attention as a resource. Well, we already talked about in attention as a general system. Remember, attention in general, we said that attention has two aspects. It is both a mental process and also resource, right? We also looked at 4 attentional ideas. That is sufficient to cover this particular aspect of it. So just to kind of review quickly, attention then as a resource is the energy that fuels cognition. And we know that this energy is limited. And the two important attentional ideas, I want to review those one more time. This task variability in attentional needs. Different tasks require different amount of attentional resources. And you can change how much of attentional resources a task requires by practice. The more practice you do, the fewer, the less the attentional resources it requires. In other words, practice is key to automaticity. Now, remember, we also did Stroop task somewhere, right? Now, try to do that. Let's do it again. Read only the color of the word out loud as quickly as you can. I'll be presented with several rows of words. I know I'm going with rows now. We did columns, I guess, last time. Just read the colors. So you're going to say red, orange, yellow, green, blue, red, orange. You know what I'm saying? You just read the color, not the word. Okay, let's see what you do. Okay, so this is blue, black, red, black, red. Oh, you see that? So the idea is that reading a word requires fewer attentional resources because you've done it so often and you're used to doing it for so long that it becomes automatic. Reading the color of the word, on the other hand, is not automatic. We haven't done that. But if you practice, you can also read the colors as quickly as you read the words, but it needs a lot of practice. So the idea is that a quick process, an automatic process, requires fewer resources and is usually fast, automatic. A fast here typically less than 1 second, whereas the conscious processes require more resources and those are slower. Well, that brings us to the end of this unit. And only one attentional system two that we need to talk about is SAS, which is supervised attentional system, which talk about in the next unit, because SAS is nothing but short-term memory or working memory.